I agree we don't live in a tyrannical patriarchy. Can you provide a better explanation for the iniquities women face, especially lateness of the right to vote, etc.? Well, 130 years ago, let's say, let's take 1895 just as our starting point. The world wasn't the same place as it is now. Rights and privileges spread as the social and economic conditions make their manifestation possible to some degree. To some degree. And I'm not suggesting that men haven't oppressed women and that women haven't oppressed men. Christ, we've been at each other's throats in many ways throughout the entire course of human history. Men at the throats of men, men at the throats of women, women at the throats of men, women at the throats of women, parents at the throats of children. Like, there's no shortage of contentiousness and tyranny that characterizes human history. So, but in 1895, the average person in the Western world lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, way below the current UN standards for poverty. Life was very, very hard. There was no reliable birth control. Like, you can't underestimate the radical consequences of reliable birth control. That opened up the world to women. And it's not just birth control, it's a whole variety of technological transformations and also an increase in the safety of the street and 100 contributing factors that have opened up the world to the freedom of women. But a huge part of that was the collective striving of men and women to free themselves from the absolute tyranny of hand-to-mouth existence. When woman was, well, let's say sexually mature back at that time around 15 or 16, very likely to be married soon after that, partly because sex outside of marriage was so unbelievably dangerous, very high probability of pregnancy, and then of death in childbirth, and then death of children, and then continual pregnancy. Women weren't the same, even biologically speaking. That the birth control pill is a biological revolution. And it took a long time to extend the full coterie of rights to people. Even men, it was like, Jesus, most men in Eastern Europe, for example, were serfs until the late 1800s, fundamentally slaves. It's not as if the common person has had the right to vote for any substantial amount of time. In some countries for a couple of 100 years, and that's all. Like, we're clambering out of the great darkness of biological history and creating a culture where people have enough freedom to exercise what would optimally be their full set of rights. And to say that didn't happen in the past primarily because of the patriarchal dominion of men is, I think, an escape from full confrontation with the absolute dreadful horror of biological history. It's a wish that all of the things about life that are deeply troublesome and terrible are a consequence of the errors made by those who control the social structure. And God, it would be really something if they had that much power. It's like, well, we can make things bad or good by whim and by fiat. It's like, no, you're facing the terrible dragon of nature, and she's something awful to behold. And your tyrannical patriarchy is a relatively ineffective force in the face of the absolute depredations of Mother Nature. I mean, even now we're powerful technologically compared to how we have been in the past. And, we've extended our life a lot, but we still only manage about 80 years. And a lot of that is still characterized by my mental and physical illness. We're still subject to the limitations, the awful limitations of biology in ways that are almost too terrifying to behold. And so we shy away from that and say, well, it's all the suffering is a consequence of something that's oppressive and under the control of human beings. It's like, I wish that was the case, but it isn't. And that's not to say that social structures lack corruption, but it's not as if 150 years ago, all men were free and all women were enslaved. The truth of the matter is 150 years ago, virtually everyone was enslaved. So, and it's a long, bloody haul out of that. And a tremendous amount of that has taken place over the last 130 years with the absolute revolution in living standard and availability of food and proliferation of consumer items and the construction of the formulation of labor-saving devices, that freed women from the grinding misery of constant domestic work for tens of hours a week at extraordinarily low pay, and the provision of universally accessible hygienic facilities. Toilets everywhere is a big deal. It allows people to move around and to operate out in the world, and tampons and sanitary products and birth control and all of that. Jesus. Women were oppressed because people were oppressed, and perhaps women were more oppressed than men, although even that's not obvious, because men suffered brutally in warfare, absolutely brutally, and died at a rate, if you eliminate childbirth deaths from the equation, died at a rate that exceeded the rate that women died at, and were required to sacrifice themselves for the protection of women and children. It's like human history is a nightmare, and that nightmare involves incredible difficulty in struggling forward to survive. And we emerged out of that, men and women together, and have been attempting to free each other to the degree that that's possible in the course of that struggle. And so that's how it looks to me.